I'm a believer in Jesus Christ who has struggled with drugs and alcohol for much of my life. My name is Mac. I'm in the right place. The Pharisees are still locked in the closet. Today, I'm able to say much of my life instead of most of my life, and that's because of Jesus Christ. He let me live to see a milestone in my recovery. After 20 years of recovery, this is the year. I've been sober longer than I was using, and that's a good thing. My childhood is pretty uneventful in terms of abuse. My parents loved me. They set good standards to live by, even though they were very strict. So try as I might, I really can't blame others for my actions. Actions that now looking back brought great shame, pain, and guilt to me and my family. But today, because of Jesus Christ, I don't have to live in the past anymore. I am indeed free. It's ironic, though, that I spent a lifetime searching for freedom in all the wrong people, places, and things. My dad was military, and so by the time I was... Hey, haircuts were a big issue in my family. High and tight wasn't popular in the 60s. My dad was military, so by the time I was 15, I had moved from California to Germany, to Washington, back to Germany, to Georgia, to California, to Virginia, only to end up in Louisiana. From moving so often, I had become a person who could blend in, and I learned to make friends very quickly. My dad preached wherever he was stationed, so I knew about God, I knew about heaven and hell, and I was taught that unless you were a Christian, you would go to hell, and that scared me. I really remember fear being the motivating factor to being baptized when I was 12 years old. I was at a church summer camp, and when this took place, the fact that there was also some good-looking girls who decided to be baptized, it made my decision easy. I appeared to enter a relationship with God, but it was for all the wrong reasons. 2 weeks later, at that same summer camp, I was introduced to marijuana by one of the counselors. I found a group of people who looked to me like they were having a lot of fun. And that's when I decided, who needs to live in fear? These people aren't worrying about anything. I jumped in head first. It was the end of the 60s and early 70s. All kinds of drugs were available. It was my mission then to try them all. I became fearless. I believed I was invincible, not realizing I had set the pace for my eventual destruction. My dad retired from the military and went to seminary school to become a full-time minister. So we moved to West Monroe, Louisiana. I was 15, and this time I didn't want to move because of all the friends I had made, lifetime friends. How would I ever find others who liked to do what I did now? Amazingly, within moving after the first week, I found the same people that lived in Louisiana. The only difference was their names. I never ran out of drugs. Acceptance was immediate. Once we arrived in Louisiana, my parents sent me to summer camp where I met Mary. At the end of the camp that week, I asked her out on our first date.
Hi, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ who struggles with codependency. My name is Mary. I grew up a pastor's kid in our church, cutting my baby teeth on the pews. My dad was an elder, preacher, teacher, and writer. My parents lived out the Deuteronomy verse to tie symbols around your children's neck and teach them as you walk by them day after day. There were always guests at the dinner table in our home. Missionaries from foreign countries stayed with us for recharging, while others flocked to our home seeking wise counsel, Bible study, and to repair wrecked marriages. During my childhood, my mother would write Bible verses on 3x5 cards and tape them up all over our bathroom walls. As I would get dressed in the morning, there staring me in the face would be several verses I would read over and over. It just became a habit without me even realizing. My sister and I would throw our heads under the covers at night and giggle, thinking how silly it was our mama reciting all those verses to us, never realizing the impact they would have on me in years to come. I grew up feeling totally cared for in love and security. I confessed Jesus as Lord of my life when I was 12 years old, and I was baptized, telling myself I would never sin again. I wanted to please God with all my heart, but just as Satan tempted Eve to doubt God's goodness, I listened to Satan also.
A new school year began. Mary was a senior, I was a junior. Life was great. We continued to date, and after a few months of close fellowship, yeah, I told you haircuts was a big deal. Life was great. We continued to date, and after a few months of close fellowship, we skipped school one day to go to Mary's house. Mary's mother was in the hospital, and her dad was out of town. I talked her into having sex for the first time, both of us, with that manipulative line, "If you loved me, you would." 2 weeks later, she didn't start her period, and we thought, no way, not after one time.
4 months later, I finally consulted a doctor, and yes, I was pregnant. No one had been pregnant outside of marriage in our church, so we had a secret. I felt all alone and was convinced Matt couldn't support us. He was only 16 at the time. By the time I was 5 months pregnant, I decided it was confession time to my dad. During my childhood, my mother had a mental illness. Doctors put her through experimental procedures like electric shock treatments. She suffered in mental hospitals and was a test subject for drugs that kept her debilitated for much of my childhood. So needless to say, my sweet mother, who loved me the best she knew how, didn't notice I had a growing belly. I had always been able to talk to my dad and knew I couldn't keep it from him any longer. I walked into the den where my dad was taking a nap. I had snuggled up to him, next to him many times throughout the years on that big old flowered sofa while he read Bible stories to me and we talked about God's love. I knelt down to him next to him eye to eye and said softly, "We need to talk, Daddy." I was prepared for him to point his finger at me and say all kinds of harsh words, but the exact opposite transpired. Tears began streaming down his cheeks, and he said he would support and love me always. I told him my plans of moving out of town and giving my baby up for adoption. I left home for my summer trip. 3 months later, it was August 17th, 1975. Remember that date because it's significant later in our story. The doctor left me in a tiny room all by myself. Labor lasted for 12 hours with no anesthesia and no family. And as they rushed me into the delivery room, a nurse shoved a gas mask over my face. I thought they were suffocating me to punish me for what I had done. I awoke later in bed sheets, soaking wet from perspiration and tears. I was experiencing emotions that were alien to me. A time that was supposed to be the happiest time of my life was my saddest. I asked the lawyer if I could see my baby just one time, but he said no. I went back home 2 weeks later and moved to a Christian college out of state. My dad was hoping to get me away from Mac.
But I followed. Once again, my parents thought by sending me to a Christian college they could fix me. And guess what? I found the same people there, they just had different names. As a matter of fact, one guy didn't have a different name. It was the guy that first introduced me to marijuana 6 years earlier at that Christian church camp. I started off a freshman rooming with seniors, not a good thing. Halfway through the semester, I was kicked out of college after sneaking out of the dorm past curfew to smoke a joint with a friend. I got busted and kicked out of school. Mary and I both came home. We were married 3 weeks later. Married life was great. We partied all the time. Later, I would come to understand that all this partying was really just a mask to mask the guilt of giving up our baby. When we'd been married 3 years, we started trying to have another baby. Mary said, "I'm quitting the party scene." I said, "Go ahead. This is how you married me. I'm not." Even in the midst of my addiction, though, I'd set a boundary, and I decided to quit everything except smoking pot because I convinced myself it just wasn't that bad. As I continued down the road of drug addiction, the conflict between Mary and I grew. Our 2 daughters were born during this time. We lived two lives, however, under the same roof, growing further and further apart. I stayed away from the house as much as possible, working overtime to pay for my drug habit. By this time, methamphetamines had become my drug of choice.
In time, I came to the realization that our marriage was totally unmanageable and I wasn't going to survive without turning my life and hurts over completely to God. I had to quit trying to be Mac's Holy Spirit and to fix him and work on my own shortcomings. I continued my life seeking the pathway to peace while Mac continued to run down the pathway to destruction. This pattern continued for 7 years. I held on to the verses I remember reading as a child on my bathroom wall. In Isaiah 55:11, it says, "When God's word is spoken, it does not come back empty, but will accomplish what he desires and achieve the purpose for which he sent it." I would repeat Isaiah 41:10 to myself the way I remembered my mother quoted it slowly and distinctly. I felt God was speaking to me. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." All those scriptures I heard as a child were now coming back to me, comforting me during the dark and lonely nights. Now I had 2 secrets I carried. We had a son we would never know, and now I had an insane husband. I say insane because I didn't know all the drugs he was doing and its effects. He was happy one day and a bear the next, to say it mildly. So I walked on eggshells to keep peace. I wore my mask to church every Sunday, wanting to look like everyone else, perfect, I thought. Mac was at church many Sundays, warming the pew while I was busy poking him discreetly to wake him up. My feeble prayer at the time was that Mac would just stay awake in church, never in my wildest dreams thinking of bigger things, better things, like Mac becoming an elder in our church, would one day start a Celebrate Recovery ministry and become the North Louisiana CR state rep.
Amazingly enough, again, even as a drug addict, there was a line that I said I would never cross. The last 2 years of my drug addiction, I started shooting up crystal meth. The one thing I said I would never do was use needles. I started doing this 10 to 12 times a day, every day. I wore long sleeve shirts all the time so no one would notice the marks on my arms. I slept a good week, 16 hours. One Sunday morning, God gave me the greatest gift that at that time I really didn't even realize. The gift was a moment of clarity. I was crashed out in the bed, and Callie, our youngest daughter, who was then 4 years old, and that's just the way she looked beside my bed. She stood beside the bed with her hands on her hips, and she said to her mother, "Why doesn't Daddy go to church with us anymore? Why doesn't he do anything with us?" Mary, in her codependency, said, "He's been working hard. He needs to sleep." And Callie replied, "Well, if he's not going, then I'm not going either." I pretended to be asleep at the time and not hear what she said. But they left for church, and all of a sudden, I felt like I ran into a brick wall. God used that little girl to break my heart. I realized at that point, in that moment of clarity, I was killing everybody that I claimed to love. It was as if my eyes were open for the first time, seeing the insanity of my life. So I immediately collected all the drug paraphernalia, scales, drugs, needles, everything, and I burned them. I knew if I didn't, I would talk myself into using them later. Then I started writing down all that I wanted to tell Mary, because for some reason I knew I would not be able to tell her out loud what I needed to tell her.
I was crushed realizing that our children were being affected. That Sunday, the sermon was on confession and how good it is for the soul. We sang the song, "It Is Well With My Soul." The words hung in my throat to where I couldn't breathe. I wanted to just run out of the building. Arriving home, I found Max sitting in his recliner. I had never seen him shed a tear, so I was very disturbed to see his eyes red and swollen from crying. I had no idea what he was about to say.
I had been raised, who's a man? Real men don't cry, and I didn't cry, ever. They never show weakness, and I never did. But what I found that morning in those tears was relief like I'd never known before in my life. I told Mary all that I had done, and I told her I wanted to start a new life. Then something very different happened. Mary, for the first time that I could remember, stepped out of her codependency and said,
Well, now who are you going to call? I'm tired of keeping secrets.
I told you, I'm through with that life. What more do you want from me?
We need someone to help us. Let's call Ray.
Ray Melton was our minister at that time, and he'd been coming to my cabinet shop for years. And he would get me to build things for him, only to find out later that they were things he really didn't even need.
It's true.
He was reaching out to me. He saw something valuable in me that others didn't see. So he came over that day to pray with us, and from that day forward, he became my mentor. Ray said, you know, you don't have to go down and confess before the whole church, but it may help somebody if you did. I knew again that I had to do that because I needed to be held accountable. If I didn't, I'd talk myself out of the life I wanted to start and go back to the life that I was living. So Mary and I went down forward that Sunday night at church, totally expecting to be shunned by everybody. The whole church, about 400 on a Sunday night, came forward afterwards with us and hugged and cried with us. They didn't know exactly what to do with me. I was their first drug addict. But what I heard them say was, keep coming back. We love you. There was a little old lady who came up to me that night and she said, Mac, you need to go to AA. And I said, is that like a car club? She said, no, that's AAA. You need AA. Mary talked to that same little old lady, and she told Mary that I ought to probably go talk to a guy at a rehab the next day. And I told her, look, I'm not crazy. I don't need that. I told you I'm going to change. I finally agreed to talk with him, but nothing more. After much discussion with the head guy, I said, all right, I'll stay. We'll have to go home and get my stuff, though.
I said, that's okay. Your stuff's in the trunk.
Our life after that point, Mary out of codependency, became a whirlwind. Rehab, 90 meetings in 90 days plus, Bible studies, making new friends, a whole new life had begun for us. We started Overcomers Outreach 2 years later, which we led for 14 years. We had approximately 25 people that came on a regular basis. Countless over the years came to that group, and many were brought to the Lord.
1 month after Mac turned his life around in February 1988, God gave us a surprise gift. The only other people that knew about our son, Heath, were my dad, my brother, and his wife. Our church youth group was going to a youth rally 5 hours away, and my sister-in-law, Chris, was one of the chaperones. The person in charge of housing was assigning each group to stay in homes. Chris got in the car with the people she was designated to stay with, and when they introduced themselves as the Arthurs, she began to get a little nervous as we knew our son's name, but we didn't know what his parents looked like or where they lived. She then looked at the 12-year-old boy and said, "What is your name?" He replied, "Heath." So she had to go one step further just to make sure and ask, "When is your birthday, Heath?" Heath said, "August 17th, 1975. There she was, riding in the car with Heath, our son, and his parents, and was headed to stay at their home overnight. During the middle of the night, our phone rang. Chris whispered, "You'll never imagine where I'm at right now." It was 2:00 a.m. I said, "Where?" Chris replied, "Heath's bed." A family at our church has the last name Heath, so I questioned her, "What are you doing in Mr. Heath's bed?" She exclaimed, "No, no, Heath, your son." Mac and I laughed, we cried, and gave prayers of thanksgiving to God. They never knew who she was. We feel God gave us that gift at that time in our lives to reassure us our son was loved and cared for in a Christian home. After waiting 7 more years, we got the call we always hoped we would get. When Heath was about to turn 19, his parents contacted us that he would like to meet us on his 19th birthday. My stomach flip-flops just recalling that day. My dad was supposed to video the momentous occasion, but as we sat down later to view it, the whole first part of the reunion was showing the ground. My dad was so excited he forgot he was holding the camera. It's been 14 years now since we first met Heath. We didn't get to see Heath's natural birth, but we were blessed with witnessing his spiritual birth as Mac baptized him into the Lord in the pond behind our home. Also, 2 years ago, his parents moved to our city, and Heath's mother now takes care of my mother since my dad passed away 2 years ago. They are best friends now. Our family continues to grow as God has blessed us now with 6 grandchildren under the age of 7.
After leading Overcomers for 13 years, my brother-in-law, John, came home, and coincidence, I think not, he said he'd been to this little church called Saddleback in Southern California. And he told me about this ministry called Celebrate Recovery and said, you know, you ought to go check it out. But in my mind, I knew everything about recovery. What else is there to know? I learned from my early AA teachings that this was contempt prior to investigation. But John, my brother-in-law, would not stop asking me and pestering me about going and seeing about what this Celebrate Recovery was all about. So finally I said, okay, 5 years ago, thinking, you know what? We could go to Southern California in August. Louisiana's not the best place to be. So we could go to Southern California, have a little vacation, and attend some of the summit. So the first day we got here at 8 o'clock. We got here at 8 so we could get here early and leave early. So we could do what was really important, check out Southern California. We ended up staying till 9 o'clock that night. The next day we arrived at 8, still thinking we would leave early, and didn't leave till 10 p.m. that night. At the end of the first day, I turned to Mary and I said, you know, we could use some of this in conjunction with what we're doing. At the end of the second day, I said, we're stopping what we're doing and we're starting this.
Yeah, that's right.
I told her, look at how many more people we can help. More than just drug addicts and alcoholics. The umbrella got a lot bigger. I was so excited that as we left that first day, in my compulsive perfectionist personality, very intensely went by Cheryl Baker and said, we're starting this. And she said, okay. After 120 days of prayer and preparation, we started Celebrate Recovery at our church on December 31st, 2004, and we've been riding the wave ever since.
Yes.
This is a slide of some of our Celebrate Recovery family back in West Monroe. You know, I love watching how God works and His plan unfold in our life. 1 year ago, actually about a year and a half ago, Sam, who had been a pastor for 40 years, tried to commit suicide. He had a secret. He'd been drinking for the last 10 years and nobody knew except his wife. The church almost killed him. When this happened, he was moved from pastor, preacher, to one of those people. So I got the call. Immediately, I went to see him in ICU, and over the next few weeks, I was able to share with him about the hope and the plans God had for the rest of his life. Sam became a great part of our Celebrate Recovery ministry. And at one of our small groups, he said, Mac, I really need to share something with you. He said, I met your son's parents here today. And I said, Sam, I know they go to church with us now. He said, no, you don't understand. 40 years ago, when I first became a preacher, I performed their wedding ceremony. God always sees the big picture, and he's right on time. I wanted to take just a moment to share with you something very special about our Celebrate Recovery, the people that were on the screen. There's 25 of them here with us. Where are you guys at? Yeah.
Yeah.
But one of them in particular I want to introduce to you today. She's the oldest person that I know who is involved in Celebrate Recovery. And that tells me something. It tells me that you're never too old for recovery or to have a closer walk with God. She will be 97 years old next month. She's on GodTube now, too, if you want to go see her. She's outlived or lived longer than 3 husbands. Not divorced. She's outlived them. She was even Mary's Sunday school teacher when Mary was 2 years old. And a year ago, she said this to us. She said, you know, I've lived a long time, a very fulfilling life. She's been married to elders and preachers in the church, but there's just one more thing I need to do that would make my life complete before I go home. And we said, what would that be? She said, I'd like to go to that CR Summit at that Saddleback church. And in her sweetest little southern voice, she said, I want to meet Brother John Baker. Her dream has come true because she's sitting right by John today. Thanks.
I started a new step study with our pastors' wives in January. It's exciting to see our leaders' wives stepping out of denial. And it's amazing as I look back at the answers I had written the first time in step study 4 years ago, the growth I've seen in myself, and now working on other areas in my recovery. I'm a work in progress until Jesus returns. I love Pastor John's new book, Healing Choices, in conjunction with the CR guidebooks to dig deeper in the 8 principles and also to give his gifts to help others gain a better understanding of what CR is all about. One of my accountability partners, Ruthie, is here today, is co-leading this step study with me. Through CR, I've built trustworthy, honest, and loving relationships with other women rather than the superficial ones I had for so many years. Our children are a part of Celebrate Recovery also. Our oldest daughter, Cherry, leads the food addiction group.
I am a believer in Jesus Christ, and I'm overcoming food addiction, perfectionism, worry, and control. My name is Cherry.
Cherry. Cherry's husband, Josh, leads the Recovery from Life Issues group. They are also our training coaches.
I'm also a believer in Jesus Christ, who struggles with lust, anger, and pride. My name is Josh.
Our youngest daughter, Callie, works the literature table.
Look at that board. Wait till they stop.
I'm a believer in Jesus Christ who struggles with codependency and worry. My name is Callie.
Hold on. And this is our 9-month-old grandson. He is in pre-recovery and he struggles with drooling. His name is Solomon. Callie's husband, Jacob, is filming to produce our own CR Newcomers video.
I'm a believer in Jesus Christ who struggles with sexual sins. My name is Jacob.
And now we want to introduce the youth minister at our church, Heath, our son, the one God gave us back. Hold on a minute.
You people are crazy. I want you to know that. I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. I struggle with control, anxiety, and sometimes my parents. My name's Heath.
Let's see here. He launched the Life Hurts, God Heals teen group this year at our CR2, so we're excited about that.
We are so thankful for Celebrate Recovery. It continues to grow and affect more people and enriches our life continually. That was obvious this last year when more new resources came available, like the Celebrate Recovery Bible or Pastor John's new book, Healing Choices. We use one of the character studies almost every Friday night to show how great men and women in the Bible were also in recovery. Men like Abraham, who had a real struggle telling the truth, and Moses, who couldn't get his anger under control, and David, who was an adulterer, and Paul, who was really distracted by religion, so much so that he murdered people, and Peter, the coward. And these are just the leaders that God chose. There's a place for us too, right? I've been working the 12 steps for over 20 years. I've never found another program or ministry that moves people through the steps like Celebrate Recovery. Even more importantly, moves people through the Beatitudes the way Jesus told us to live in the beginning anyway. Being on the front line of what we consider to be the ministry at the church, we're able to bind up the brokenhearted. We proclaim freedom for the captives in Jesus' name. And we release from darkness the prisoners of hurts, hang-ups, and habits. Celebrate Recovery has helped us reach more hurting people than we ever thought possible. How can we repay the Lord for His goodness? We share the hope and joy we found in Jesus Christ. Today, we are making life's healing choices, and that's Celebrate Recovery.
Thank you.